thank you to the, at this stage, few participants for the roundtable on how embracing European regulation can have a positive impact on your business. Actually, it's a question. So we all know that Europe, and especially the European Commission, they are pushing and accelerating the digitalization of finance. And this roundtable is really about verifying what is cooking exactly, how can we deal with this, and we have a great panel for this today. In order, we have Frederik Rosseel, who is CEO at Docbyte, Belgian RegTech, Tom Deprins, who is Global Director Financial Services Compliance at Microsoft, and Agnieszka Bruyère, Vice President IBM Cloud for Europe, Middle East and Africa, if I have this right. The panelists will introduce themselves in a bit. I am Philippe Deprins. I'm a financial services and fintech regulatory lawyer at Simont Braun here in Brussels. A little word on the concept. So it's a roundtable, but it's also an interactive roundtable, and I really want to stress the part interaction. So we're going to deal with European regulation with a focus on the digital finance package and everything which relates to this topic. I have prepared a few questions to get the conversation going, but really we count on you to get the debate, to keep the debate ongoing. So whenever you feel that a question pops up, please raise your hand. I will give you the floor, state your name, and you can go. As requested by the organization, and it's also important to stress that the idea, I know it's about regulation, but the idea is not to become too technical, right? So it's really discussing the potential social impact of upcoming regulation and really trying to identify where the opportunities are for fintechs, for financial service providers at large, but also for obviously third-party service providers like we have here today, and obviously also for the end clients, for the customers. So I'm going to pass the floor to the panelists for a quick introduction on who they are and what their background is. Agnieszka, if that's all right for you, I propose to start with you.
Yes, good morning, everybody. So my name is Agnieszka Bruyère. I'm in charge of IBM Cloud for Europe. My background is a lot in security and compliance. I spent 5 years in this space. That's why even if I'm in charge of the overall cloud, I'm really focusing about the compliance and security aspects in the cloud and following out in the name of IBM all the sovereignty initiative in Europe. Even if we are talking about the regulation, there are also the stream which is much more kind of initiative that might impact financial sector overall.
Okay, thank you. Tom?
Thank you. I'm Tom Deprins. I live in Brussels, Belgium, but I work in a global role within Microsoft on global regulatory compliance. So my job is mostly to work in financial services with regulators, I'd say globally, as well as with customers, helping them navigate all kinds of challenges around this, as well as explore opportunities. Thank you.
Thank you, Frederik.
Hello, I'm Frederik Rosseel. I'm the CEO and founder of Docbyte. And with Docbyte, we focus mainly on digitizing and automating document processes for mainly financial service companies and insurance companies. As such, we provide solutions for, on the one hand, so digitizing, so the typical data classification, extraction type of thing. There are several parties here today who offer that kind of service, but also things like archiving of digital documents and information. And with regard to that, of course, there's a lot of legislation coming, which is already existing in Belgium, but which is also going to come on a European level with regard to data and information exchange and on how to preserve that information to demonstrate authenticity, for example.
Okay, thank you, Frederik. So, as promised, a general question to kick off the conversation, but again, don't hesitate to intervene. So, we know that the European Union has decided to accelerate the digitalization of digital finance, of financial services at large, and they did that, among other things, with the 2020 Digital Finance Package. We will talk about that, I'm sure, later as well. And the European Commission has a double ambition when doing that. So they have this idea, through this package, to really foster innovation, to really give consumers and professional end clients as well access to innovative products. They really want to push this with this package. But on the other hand, and as always, European regulator, they are also about consumer protection. They're also about financial stability. So it will be key to find the right balance between those double ambitions, basically. And so as a general question to you, what is it exactly that you are looking forward to in the digital finance package, but also in connected regulation? How do you see that there can be opportunities there for fintechs, but also for technical service providers like yourself and for end clients? And obviously, do you see any pitfalls, and can you maybe share a bit insight on, how can we avoid these pitfalls? Agnieszka, do you want to start?
Yeah, so definitely. So when we are thinking about the regulation, it's always being in the box and having all these constraints. But I believe that the biggest thing is really about the innovation, and this is really, I would say that the main objective of all this regulation is really innovation and how to make the banking services more meaningful for the clients and proposing the innovative services. So that's why I think that this is the foundation, right? So that's why we have a lot of opportunities. Frederick maybe will talk about this from business-wise. In terms of regulation, I think that it's interesting because it's actually setting it sets the frameworks and gives us the baseline in which condition we should operate. So this is an opportunity for the fintechs, banks, but also big companies like IBM and Microsoft to be very specific about what should be done from cybersecurity perspective for any other aspects to make a technical solution supporting a business solution reliable for the clients, for banks, and also from cybersecurity perspective, but also financial stability, etc., etc. So I think that this is really a good thing, even regulation as such, because it gives specific frameworks, and we will be talking about this, how to make it less a burden for the companies, including banks and fintechs, and better visibility. I think that what we are trying to achieve is really building the trust. I think that in the foundation it was something that was stated about building the trust. It means have a clear framework, have the clear evaluation about from the regulation perspective, if it's compliant or not, to enable the innovation.
Okay, great. Thank you, Tom.
Yeah, I want to echo what Agnieszka is saying. So I think the regulatory context, it's really responsible innovation that they want to stimulate at the European regulatory level, at the European government level. And so regulation is kind of necessary. And we get a kind of a double feedback. So a lot of, especially smaller institutions, struggle with the volume of regulation that's there, specifically around use of cloud technology, artificial intelligence, etc. And there's more coming along the way. So there's certainly, I think, the thing to think about is how do we get this regulation in a way that is still manageable and practical. But I find it mostly a positive story. So one thing we definitely observe globally, for instance, when it comes to using our cloud services, is that we see a lot more traction on the European side versus, for instance, in the US, where you see much less regulation around this. And the reason for that is quite simple. With the regulatory context, you get more clarity. So when the EBA, ESMA, EIOPA issued their European guidelines a couple of years ago, suddenly it became clear like what you can and cannot do and what is expected. And so that as soon as the regulation was there, we saw a huge uptake in use of cloud. And so I think it's ultimately going to end up positive, although there are some caveats and some risks in the way this is being implemented. And so I spent quite a bit of time actually talking to regulators also about being mindful about the practical implications that some of these regulations have.
Okay, thank you. Frederick, you come from a different background.
So we look more at this from a business perspective. So what it offers to our customers and what we can do with it. So we follow up on these regulations, and for us, if you look at the digital finance package, was one of the big motivations or the ambitions of the digital finance package is for financial service companies to offer their services in a digital way and deliver them across Europe. So for that, of course, you need frameworks, and the digital finance package, to put it like that, they express the ambitions, but they don't tell you how to do it. So for that, for example, what is one of the limitations? So they see that there's not enough adoption of digital identification. So there's only 15 European countries that have implemented a version of a digital identity. So they want to have more countries adopting that. That's one thing, for example. Another one is that you see clear gaps, for example, in digital signing. There's not a lot of people who know that, but if you sign a document digitally, you also have to be able to demonstrate over the years that document is digitally correctly signed, and that you can demonstrate the legal validity of that over the years to come. As a consequence, digital signing hasn't got the adoption that everybody would want to have seen, because in a lot of companies they know that there's a compliance issue with that. So there's also legislation in Europe-wide with regard to qualified preservation of digital signatures. But in Belgium, for example, the legislator saw that there was a gap because a lot of documents, contracts that are digitally signed, and there's no way that you know how you have to digitally archive such a document. So the Belgian legislator has implemented how would I say, a description of how you should do that. That's a solution on which we are working and that we are going to offer on the market next year. But what is interesting for us is that next to the digital finance package, there is the revision of the EIDAS regulation that is also going to describe that on a European level. It's going to set the rules for that. So not just for digital archiving, but also with regard to digital identity. So things like a digital wallet in which you can store different types of documents, but of course, you will have to be able to demonstrate the authenticity of, for example, of your digital identity card, digital driver's license. That's one thing. Next to that, there's another legislation coming, the single digital gateway. So there's also another gap with regard to KYC. So, but those gaps are being filled with new regulations that are coming. So, and that's the interesting part for us. That's the interesting thing for other fintechs, because there's room for a lot of new solutions that are going to be offered on the market, but in a more standardized way.
Okay, thank you, Frederik. Anyone who wants to pick in on this from the audience? I do recognize a few representatives of fintechs and financial service providers. Anyone who wants to share their take on upcoming European regulation at this point? Not yet. Okay. Another topic that we've identified in the digital finance package, or which isn't really in the digital finance package, but which is a bit an overarching principle, and another ambition coming from the European Commission, is this goal to create synergies, really, between innovative startups, new businesses on the one hand, and on the other hand, really well-established firms. And I think that we can fairly say that today we have representatives of both categories of companies around the table. And so my next question would be, how do you see that in practice? I mean, are those things that you are actively following up on? Do you have projects ongoing, really synergies between established players and more newcomers, I would say?
So definitely we were talking about this regulation, so just to let you know that we are developing a FS framework, which is basically a kind of sum of regulation that the banks needs to comply with. We will talk about Dora afterwards, I believe, to say how it will shift the paradigm from regulating the banks to the regulating the providers, the tech providers actually, which is the thing. But when we are establishing this FS framework, which is a set of controls, more than 280 controls, is really to be able to host technology players, fintechs, that don't need to care about the compliance, at least from the technology layer, because it's a kind of built-in and control all over in a continuous time all over the respect of the security rules and compliance. So this is something that we enable, and we are building this ecosystem with the software provider, a solution provider, more than 100 today, to kind of remove the burden of the compliance from the infrastructure piece. And then you've got this initiative around Gaia-X and open spaces, right? Yep. So I think that there is still a lot of progress to be done, because it was initially very focused on the setting, the governance, and about the rules, etc., etc. Just to let you know, again, Gaia-X mission is not to set the rules. The rules are set by EU Commission, potentially by ENISA, being the cybersecurity organization from EU level. But Gaia-X is really to give the visibility who is respecting the rules that is set up on European level, but also, and essentially, it's about these data spaces, right? And especially in the finance sector. So we didn't do a lot of progress here, all collectively. But on IBM side, at least, our ambition is really to be much more active in the participation in these data spaces, especially data space for finance. As you know, there is more than 20 use cases identified by the user, and the intention to be much more active to make participate users, tech companies, and fintech, to bring together the knowledge from different perspectives, different backgrounds, to build the new services all together and propose this to the market. So for us, it's on the one side is this ISV approach with this FS framework and continuous controls from the technology layer, from regulatory perspective. On the other side is really building with fintechs and in this data space approach in Gaia-X, the new services.
Okay, thank you. Tom?
Yeah, so there's a couple of elements on the synergy that I want to touch upon. One is between, I say, fintechs and the big firms, and I'll talk to that about a second. But on the regulatory side, I want to tell a little bit about my own personal history, actually. Before I joined Microsoft, I was working in a big Belgian bank doing a global deployment of a cloud solution. And so the challenge that you get there is really the regulatory fragmentation at the time. It was a bank insurer. There were presidents in 6 or 7 countries across Europe. And so we had to deal with 15 different regulators where you have to submit a case at the time for approval in most cases, etc. And so this becomes challenging as a bank, but at least I had a project team to do that. But if you're like a small fintech, some of them don't even have an in-house lawyer and have to work with outside counsel only. Some of them have an IT staff of just a few folks. And so it becomes extremely challenging. So I think the European Commission and lawmakers realize this, and there's a lot of harmonization ongoing. And so I'm really positively surprised by the regulation that has come out, at least in the FSI space so far. So I mentioned the EBA as my EIOPA guidelines. These are certainly helpful. What hasn't been tackled really, and what I think under Dora will change a little bit is the governance model around this, having to go to all of these individual parties and deal with that. But I do believe that we're on a positive trajectory, and we'll talk a little bit more, I think, about Dora and some other elements out there. At least if you're a European player. At a national level, I can't really comment as much. But even there, we see that there's a lot of, I'd say, at national level, they're mostly aligning with the European front, so it becomes a little bit less complicated. I do want to leave a practical tip for folks out there, at least from a Microsoft perspective. We've got compliance checklists by country, which really break down all of the laws and regulations in individual countries and cross-check these and map these against things like certifications, etc., which can be very helpful in getting through, navigating through some of this. And probably, it's maybe an idea for another fintech, it would be good to kind of have a hub of navigating this also going forward. But it is challenging, but I do think it's going in a positive direction.
Yeah. An idea for a RegTech then. Okay.
An idea for a RegTech indeed.
Okay, cool. Somebody who wants to react at this point in the room?
I will try to make it a bit more interactive, right?
Thank you very much.
I'm also from Wolters Kluwer, so I'm, so to speak, so half big, half ragtag, so to speak. So I'm a bit in between at this moment in time. I believe a lot in the collaboration between larger firms, as you were pointing out, with the backing of a whole organization, I would say. But I also do like the fintech in the sense that they can focus. And I think as long as we, and with we I really mean both organizations, have an ecosystem as a kind of the end goal, this works fine. The second thing I want to, because we're talking about regulations, but there are different kind of regulation. I think one of the difficulties is knowledge. What I mean by that is because regulation becomes so big, so dispersed, no one can be good in everything. So specializing, but also collaboration will be more important. If I look at back in the days when I started in IFRS, for instance, when I was actually discussing this with people, I felt really alone. Now there are a lot of these people. But the point is, you always have to have these kind of leaders that educate, I would say, and knowledge sharing becomes more and more important, because back in the days, you could do this on a Saturday morning and you were up to date with the regulations. No one can do that anymore, because the train of documentation, regulations that comes out, it's too much for one person. Leaves alone an army to actually discuss that. So collaboration for me is the only way forward.
Okay,
Can
definitely.
I add something to
Yeah,
that?
can you?
Okay.
Certainly.
So that's entirely true. So as a smaller company, we are really, due to the amount of regulations, we are really forced to focus on a couple of solutions, because it's simply become impossible to follow up on all of them. Also for us, it's always been, how would I say, we've always been a bit on the fringe between business and IT. So internally we have people who are capable of reading those texts. Even yesterday, let's say for example, over the weekend I've read another one to give feedback about that internally. So another guy asked whether I had a problem sleeping, because I can assure you it's not even if you look at the text of the digital finance package, for example, it's not great literature. So it's not something that you're going to read for your pleasure. So you really have to focus. And with regard to that, collaboration with bigger players, in the past we had a lot of contacts with the larger players, and one of the issues that you have with the fragmentation of all the different regulations is that if you talk about project sizes, to put it like that, and the amount of money that goes into them, for the bigger players it's simply not interesting. If we tell them what the total cost is of one of our projects, for them it's really too small. So one of the advantages with having a European regulation is that the market size becomes larger. It's standardized for an entire European market, which makes the amounts of money that go into that more interesting, and which makes it more interesting for the bigger players to look at those and to work with fintechs that can offer a solution, because the solution will work for the entire European market.
With the ambition to have a kind of harmonized European regulations, right? So we are not there yet, but if you are listening to European Banking Authority, etc., and even if we have this regulatory instances in the markets, this is clearly a statement, right? Having the European regulations strong enough to replace kind of, because this is the idea of Europe, to replace all this local regulation. So I think that this is not, we are not there yet, but this is coming, as you said, Frederick, it will give something very powerful and remove a huge burden from big and small companies as well to innovate, right? Definitely.
And also with regard with knowledge sharing, that's also something that we do via trade organizations, even on our website, sharing articles about regulations, because it's true. A lot of companies don't even know, even to be honest, financial service companies, it's hard to keep up with all the different regulations. They have a look at the ones that impact the business directly from a like AML, but the other ones are a bit more distant, to put it like that.
Okay, I've indeed seen on your website that you have your own knowledge sharing there for everyone, articles and updates, which is definitely very helpful. Thank you for your question. Maybe pass the mic. Thank you.
Is there really a trend towards more harmonization on a European level? I remember PSD2, which is also a typical EU directive thing that then had to be implemented in local legislations, and at the end we had, what was it at the time, 28 different legislations.
Yep.
Do we see any progress on that level, on a European level, that they can impose more the directive as being a local law instead of, or a European law, instead of just a directive that has to be implemented in each country locally with different flavors?
I think so, and the path is to be much more specific, because why some countries are taking care of implementation, because on European level we've got those directives. And directives are not specific enough, and it requires the local authorities to work on the specifics, right? Once we've got the regulation on EU level, which are specific enough, it's not anymore a question of be specific on the market level. So I can tell you I'm working in France, so from a financial sector perspective, I can see from a lot of authorities, including Banque de France, etc., that they are really working with EBA and this digital operational resilience act, etc., and they can see that they have the level of specifics detailed enough that they do not need to work on the implementation and then have the specific, which is different from Belgium and other countries. So I can see clearly a movement on this one. So I hope that we will see the results of this in 2022 with Dora, to make sure that it's much more, that this is the same thing in every single country, right? So, and then of course the country authority will have just the control role and not settings the regulation as such. So I can see it happen more and more, and at least this is the ambition, I believe.
Yeah. Just maybe, yeah, you wanted to add something?
I just want to add, so I don't know if everybody is familiar with DORA, stands for the Digital Operational Resiliency Act. And so one of the concepts in there, which is definitely positive, is this lead overseer over what's being called critical third-party providers. I'm sure the big tech firms, but also a lot of financial providers may be part of this. And this is kind of unique and novel, to respond to your question specifically. Like, you get this central European oversight, and although some of the enforcement seems to be still at a national level, potentially, I mean, there's text going into the council and the parliament right now. It looks like certainly this trend towards this European finance package and this European harmonization is set and is not going away. So I'm quite positive on, I mean, we've seen, as mentioned before, a lot of solutions being implemented at a national level by fintechs, and it's really challenging to cross borders into other countries. And I think a lot of this, Europe is super focused on breaking these barriers and making sure that we have a free European market. So I think there is a positive trend coming up there.
Yeah, maybe just also to pick in on the question, we touched upon Dora, and we're going to continue talking about that. Another pillar from the digital finance package is MiCA. It's the market in crypto assets. And there, again, the idea of the European Commission is clearly to have this shift, as you raised in your question, to go towards harmonization on a higher level, so that there is less space for gold plating and local adaptations. But if you look at MiCA, for example, when the digital package was, finance package was released, it came with the message that it was a proposal that was very well advanced, that was kind of, oven ready, to use that term. But then once that it came on the desks of the local regulators, and for example here in Belgium, the National Bank of Belgium, it caused quite a lot of panic actually when they looked at those texts and they say, okay, this is really the European text, it will be a regulation, so it doesn't need any transposition. So if we want to do something about it, we have to do it now while it's still a proposal. And so we know in Belgium, but also from colleagues in other countries, that there is heavy lobbying going on from the sector, but also from regulators to really tone down what is in there, because once it's a regulation, they are obliged to apply it all at the same level. So we see that there is a shift from the European Commission, but local regulators need to adapt to that, with as a consequence that in the end we will have maybe, probably, European regulation, but now it is being very delayed because the 2020 digital finance package, it was in the fall of 2020. Now we're looking at a definitive text for MiCA not before 2023, 2024, because of the fact that all those regulators want to add, their input, and it also remains to be seen what the final outcome will be of this harmonized text. But it will be in the end harmonized, indeed. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Well, Tom, Agnieszka, you introduced the topic already. Maybe a bit more on Dora, because there is MiCA, there is Dora. Those are really the spearheads of the digital finance package. So as Tom said, it's the proposal for a regulation on digital operational resilience. And so to frame a bit its importance, it's really about the fact that today financial service providers, fintechs, they become more and more dependent on their technical service providers, on the solutions that those technical service providers offer. And so with that come risks. And so the ICT risks related to the services that they take from those technical service providers become inherent to the industry itself. And so when we look at Dora, there is a lot of different topics that are covered there. I've had them here before me. It's about risk management, incident management, reporting. It's about testing to anticipate technical risks. It's about information sharing. Again, if you look at it from a pure content side, one could say, okay, there is not a lot of new stuff in here. We have seen this before, fragmented. Okay, it's harmonized now, but there are other things, and we already touched upon it, other upsides on Dora. And so my question would be for the panelists, and I think it will specifically be for Agnieszka and Tom, given your background, is okay, and what is Dora for you, and where do you see this major upside, basically? I mean, you already touched upon it before, but
so Dora, so it's a revolution, not in terms of measures, but in terms of the idea that it's not anymore a regulation for banks, but these are the regulation for the technology providers. So this is a huge shift. So this is a great thing for all the financial institution and fintech, because actually the burden of being compliant is shifting to the technology providers and cloud providers. I can tell you it's for us, but for us it's extremely interesting because we've got this Financial Services Council. We are working with more than 100 banks to try to establish the baseline, what technical measures should be implemented to be compliant with the regulation. I can tell you 100 banks, 100 frameworks. So it's extremely challenging to implement a kind of baseline across a number of entities, right? So what's interesting with Dora, so of course we are using the existing framework. So these are not the regulation, but we are using NIST, we are using ISO, we are using, of course, GDPR principles, etc. So the frameworks exist, so it's nothing kind of new, but maybe we will add with the new things about audits, etc. coming. But basically 90%, this is something that we are doing, but it's not harmonized, right? Mm-hmm. So this is great because Dora will bring this harmonization about the security measures that we need to implement that will be based on the things we already know, but it's not harmonized. So it will really bring to the industry this harmonization. So we will have a common baseline about the security and compliance measure that needs to be implemented. And then as a cloud providers, we will be accountable to actually make it happen. It won't be anymore the bank who needs to check on us. So of course there will be all this control still in place, but this is our responsibility to put it in place and make sure that we are compliant. So this is a great advantage and way forward for the banking sector as such, even if of course there's some challenging discussion about audits. Maybe Tom will touch on this because, of course, it's an important topic. But on the other hand, there is all the cyber resiliency aspects, but there is also the aspects about resiliency from the systemic perspective, so concentration risks, disaster recovery risks, right? So all of these aspects are very important, and we've seen also all these sovereignty initiatives. It's how to make sure that the financial sector in Europe is not fully dependent on a provider, etc., and how we make sure that actually it's a kind of balance, and that we've got this financial sector resiliency. So I know that a lot of banks are very interested in the concentration risk subject, very present in Europe, but also in UK, and this question of being still kind of independent of technology, even if technology is everywhere.
Okay, thank you, Agnieszka. You've touched upon the concentration risk and also data sovereignty. I think those are interesting concepts. If we have some more time, we can definitely get back to those topics. Tom, you already touched upon the Dora. Anything you want to add?
Yeah, sure. So, as Agnieszka said, the Dora, one of the things that is brand new is, as Microsoft, as tech companies, we weren't regulated directly, and so there's this direct oversight is coming, and so initially it made some people nervous up in our management change, but now it's seen as a positive thing, but not unconditionally. So I think it's logical. I mean, more and more reliance upon big tech companies, we become an operational risk to the financial system, a systemic risk. So the question, if Microsoft goes down entirely tomorrow, would there be a systemic impact? Potentially, yes. We'll see how that will work out. So that there's some oversight, that makes a lot of sense. And so we're not against that. But the discussion I have with regulators quite often, and where we don't agree, let's talk about that, it's more interesting, is actually the regulators say, oh, but ultimately the responsibility stays with the bank and the FSI end to end. And so that part is I think it's just throwing more regulation on top of what's already a huge pile. So I think it would be better, and I advocate for even stronger and stricter oversight of ourselves, the tech companies, but that also removing that responsibility away from the institutions, specifically when it comes, for instance, to data centers. I mean, we run, I think we have one of the most, if not the most, data centers in the world that we run and operate, and we get audit requests. And I've been at both sides. I've been an auditor in the bank. I've been at the receiving end of audits in an FSI. We get these individual audit requests. People want to run around the data centers. It's regulators, it's customers. Sometimes with a big FSI, it's 10 different business lines within the customers that want to do an audit, and that is insecure. It's an operational risk. It helps nobody, because it would be much better, just like with critical infrastructure, that there would be an overseer doing these audits of the data centers, issuing a certificate and saying, listen guys, this is it. So where we don't agree is, I think, imposing the responsibility end-to-end totally upon the FSI, if they're relying upon tech companies, is not helpful for anybody, because there's only so much, it doesn't make sense anymore. So this is what we are advocating for, and I think where we're not aligned with some of the things in Dora. Just to give one example, there's some others I could go into as well, but I think this is kind of the most important one.
Yeah, most important, because clearly it creates a risk exposure, right? The more people you get to the data center, the most you get exposed to any kind of incidents, bad luck, etc.
And also, I mean, where are you going to find all these people? Who's got the skill and the ability to do these audits? I know the regulators are struggling with them, so they don't have these. Banks are struggling. Fintechs, I can't imagine how they would even do that. And so it doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
Period.
Yeah, absolutely. Interesting perspective.
Yeah.
Somebody who wants to react on this from the audience? Somebody who's working with cloud providers, technical service providers?
Somebody wants to visit the data center?
It's not possible.
Okay. Okay, great. Another question, and it's again more not something that is explicitly expressed by the European Commission or explicitly stated in the digital finance package, but it's this I would say this this acknowledgement from a European perspective that today the technical service providers for the financial services industry, they are very much or even exclusively US-based big tech firms, a handful of them, or really to use it as a cliche. And so this idea is also a bit on how, from the European perspective, how will we create European champions one day that can also be at service to the local European financial services industry. Now, Tom, you already touched upon it in one of the earlier questions, is that the approach in Europe and the US, as we all know, is very different. In Europe, we have this regulation-first approach. We see that in a lot of different domains, be it artificial intelligence, be it cloud. We want to regulate things first. We want to create a framework, and then we'll see how the business reacts. While in the US, we have a very different approach. It's really about private companies having a go, and then regulation will follow or not, or to a lesser extent. And for sure, there are positive and negative aspects to both approaches. And I wanted to see what your reaction was on that. Maybe Frederick, we can start with you.
Okay. So one of the reasons why this is a good approach from a European point of view is because, of course, the US market is a big market. So for companies, if they want to offer a service aimed at the US, there's immediately a lot of money in it. For the European market, which is really fragmented with regard to regulations, languages, and other types of cultural differences, it's a big challenge. So in a lot of cases, if you want to start a service, it might not be that worthwhile to start offering it in Europe, because it can cost you a lot of money to bring it to other countries. So if there comes a regulation that tries to create a framework that works for the entire European Union, that's a thing that we should praise and we should be happy about, because that allows us to offer a service across Europe. Next to that, in a lot of cases, so one of the most important things, of course, from a European point of perspective, what do they try to do with those types of regulations? When it comes to digital, is trying to create trust. So creating trust in a digital future, to put it like that. So create something which is standardized across the market, that all people know, that all companies know, on the one hand, so they create the framework, but on the other hand, and that's known to a lesser extent, but Europe also provides in some cases open source tools to implement some services, so that they can get them standardized more easily. For example, for digital signing, a lot of people don't know that, but it's there's a building block available for digital signing, so qualified digital signing, and everybody who wants to implement a signing solution could take those open source tools. But of course, on which level our play is going to compete, it's on the user experience, and on the company itself, not on the service, not on digital signing, not on the technology. So with regard to that, what Europe offers is are the tools and framework that allows everybody to become a digital company with a higher level of confidence. So it's something which is good in my opinion.
Okay, thank you. Sure.
I'm fully supportive of sovereignty issues and challenges and sovereignty initiative then, because as a European, we want Europe to be strong, right? So I think it's personal motivation. And as Frederick said, I think that there are a lot of open source, and this is very important. And so there is this battle on the infrastructure layer and the use case layer. The question is what we are doing on the infrastructure layer, and there is different position from different players, right? And that's why we have this concentration risk aspects that I think that must be addressed, but in terms of rather overall resiliency. Because if you have a global provider, whoever it is, IBM, Microsoft, you can still have a global incident, right? So if you even very operationally thinking about resiliency from the overall IT perspective, you should even consider different options, right? To make sure that you have this resiliency from IT perspective. It allows to reveal European champions, including in the infrastructure layers. So we are supporting of this approach. Now, I think that the future is in the use cases, as Frederik said, and we need to make sure that we are leveraging existing innovation, leveraging open source, and we are collaborating, because being very closed and not open to everything what exists all over the world, and innovation coming from everywhere to build the new services for the clients and citizens. This is really the objective, to stay open while building the specific use cases, as Frederik, you said. And then I think that when we are talking about the sovereignties, also Philippe, you touched on this about the data sovereignty. So just to make sure that the data who is owned by European companies, it's not used to create the business models by the company who does not own this data. So I know that there is all of this GDPR, then Schrems 2, and then the consequences of Schrems 2, which are quite important. But I think that we don't need to forget the foundation of this is really to make sure that the data is serving to create the business model to the person who is the owner of the data, and nobody else is using this data to create business models. So I think that, and this is also this kind of European data sovereignty aspect, to make sure that Europe is leveraging the data and technology to create these new services, to have the benefit of digital economy for Europe and for the companies in Europe and clients, citizens, etc.
Okay, thank you, Agnieszka. Tom, you on US versus Europe and the difference in approaches?
Yeah, so the observation is simple. So it's true. Big US tech is dominating, especially cloud services that are being provided to companies. And so then the question becomes, what do you do about it? And so concentration risk is, paraphrasing this a little bit, specifically systemic concentration risk, like if any of these big players gets a failure, that might have some impact. But there's also a geopolitical aspect to this. So a lot of control, especially with Trump in office. He's gone now. There was a lot of nervousness about all of this control through the US. And so problem statement, fully agree with. And so then the question is, what do you do about it? And in the regulation, the challenge with regulation, I think it's supposed to be tech neutral. It's supposed to be an equal level playing field. And there's only so much you can do, because a good example with that we saw with GDPR and with Schrems 2 ruling, etc., is announcement that we as Microsoft made, but some other companies as well, that are helping to kind of deal with the issues in very creative ways. And so you're kind of dealing with this, and in another way you're not. And so I think I would go back to what I say is first principles, and one of the key ones is everything is becoming data-driven. The economy is going to be data-driven, definitely a lot of these companies. So data sovereignty, the way I look at it, does not mean storing your data in Europe or having this within European boundaries. It can be, and that can be a part of it. But data sovereignty should start at the enterprise or at the consumer level, and say, like, how do I stay in control of my data, and who's and what technology, what partnerships, etc., should I engage in on getting to that point? And so this is kind of the thing that's a little bit omitted. So it's there. I do think a lot of responsibility and a lot of deep thinking should go into data controllers, enterprises, on how to deal with data. And I wouldn't get too confused by the political aspects, because you can be very quickly find yourself locked in a new situation, which is on European ground. So I really focus on, is my data portable? If tomorrow I have a new strategy, how do I move my data around? And who can access this data, etc. These kind of things become super important. And I don't want to go into a tech discussion, but this creates kind of whole new conversation, but at least it's the right way to think about it, at least from our perspective.
Okay, thank you. Yes, please.
Hello.
Yes, it works.
Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry. So Frederik from Data Village, and working on data sovereignty, data control, ownership. So coming back on your point about starting from the regulation or starting from the solution or the corporate. So I think it's good to start from the regulation because it brings new way to think about what could be the next step, what could be the next solution. In data, you have the Data Governance Act that will go into a right way. But I think in Europe, we have another issue. So talking about ourselves, so we are looking about a bit technical, but confidential computing solution. Where do we go? We go obviously on the one that provides already this solution on the market, which are not European player. These are back to American players. So back to American players. So I think there is an issue in Europe. It's good to start from the regulation, but we should be able to react faster to that regulation, like setting up Gaia X in a faster way and maybe losing less time to talk about it, but doing it. I would have preferred to be on Gaia X, but it's not possible. So I don't know what you think about that, but I don't think the point is to start from the regulation. It's more about the reactivity in Europe from all aspects to create new solution in a fast way.
May I respond to that? Because
there's
an interesting precedent actually within Microsoft that I do want to highlight. We had a sovereign cloud offering in Germany with these systems and another firm kind of sitting in between Microsoft and then the customers who were controlling all of the access to that. So that was literally a sovereign cloud, and we have sovereign clouds in China and some other regions as well, with 21 ViaNet, which is really the whole ambition is there that Microsoft, but by consequence also US government and Secret Service, etc., would not be able to access that data. But there wasn't a huge success with that. So we set this up in Germany. I'm not even aware if it still exists because I'm not aware of any customer using this right now because that comes at a cost. And the cost is twofold. It's more expensive because suddenly you have this party, of course, it's commercial enterprise needs to make some money as well. But then secondly, every brand new feature, confidential compute would be an example, it gets developed somewhere, it's usually released in a US region first, then it comes to other global regions, etc. And then so these sovereign clouds are the very last ones that follow. If I take the Microsoft Teams example, in Microsoft Teams is still in China being deployed and looked at like how do we deploy this, how do we enable them to communicate outside of China because of, again, the sovereignty issues. So there's this trade-off that you have to make as well, and that is something people should be aware of. I'm skeptical because I love it from a philosophical perspective. It makes a lot of sense, but in implementation, it hasn't worked in the past. So what's different that it would work now? I'm not sold on it personally.
But I think that your question was about what do we do to have the innovative technology in Europe? Why confidential computing is coming from IBM or Microsoft or whoever, right? So there is no a simple question when I'm talking about French government, right? What do we do about this, right? So I think that this is a different subject than regulation. It's really about how do we work in research and development, what's the public funds for research and development, what about our schools, right, etc. What do we do about our researcher, why do they leave for US, etc. So this is a very different subject, right, about the economic policy in Europe and the investment that Europe is doing, in especially in this research space, right? Because we can see that research is much better in US than it's in Europe. So I do not think regulation will not fix it, right? I think that the only thing that will fix it's talents that we keep in Europe to have this innovation, and it means to keep the talent. It means environment. It means budgets. It means all of the stuff. So it's really the policy, economical policy on European level, right? And it's not kind of regulation, really discussion, right? But still, I mean, confidential computing is a great thing, and I think that we should not say because it's a US technology that we should not use it. And by the way, let's use it and think about what next step could be, which will be European one. So we still need to keep this openness because there is some financial challenges, like Tim said, but also we need to continue the progress because if we close ourselves to outside, there is a risk that we are not moving fast enough and not leveraging all the innovation coming from elsewhere. So anyway.
Okay, thank you. Does it answer your question? Yeah. I have some more questions in the back. Yeah, please. No idea.
Normally you need to be seated, right?
Yeah.
So I'll stay in a mask. My name is Maria Staszkiewicz. I represent the European Digital Finance Association. We are a federation of 14 fintech associations from Europe. And Agnieszka already mentioned a lot of things I wanted to say about regulation because yes, I mean, to one extent, it helps, especially smaller companies that want to access other markets and create. It's a way to create a single market in the EU without borders. But at the same time, we sometimes have the feeling that regulation that is implicitly directed at U.S. companies is also killing. At the same time, no one realizes it might kill not only innovation, but it might kill. The replicas, the copies, or the competitors of American companies here, because the same regulation will apply to European players as well. It cannot be discriminative. So regulation, yes, but not in the way the European Commission is very often presenting. And I wanted to ask you also about other acts, because digital finance package is all about finance, but there are other acts, DSA, DMA, and the AI Act that also touching upon financial services. And I wanted to know your opinion about especially the AI Act, because it includes a portion of, it tries to regulate a portion of financial services. In my opinion, personal, and our association, parts of it also represents it, is that the AI Act is once again trying to re-regulate what's already been regulated, and it may have a very negative feedback on innovative companies who would have to comply with a lot of new administrative burdens, and then in the end may leave the continent to regimes that are not so heavy on regulation. Thanks.
We are not pushing for regulation.
Wants to answer that?
Yeah, on the AI Act, I don't know where this is going to go. It was a very interesting discussion I saw between the US, European difference in vision again. The US does not want to stifle, their view is simple, they don't want to stifle innovation at this time, so they say they're going to regulate at the time when the problem presents itself, and it doesn't present itself today. And Europe is thinking about this in a very different way. When I read what's in there, the focus is really on these high-risk use cases, and then the question is, are these adequately defined or not? I don't know. I don't really have a strong opinion on whether one approach is better than the other. But again, at least you may not like what's in Europe, but at least there's some clarity on it. At least it's a proposal, by the way. And I do think the clarity is going to kill certain initiatives in AI for sure, and then others are going to maybe get implemented more quickly in Europe, because now the regulatory context is clear. Although in the US, yeah, this is not a good comparison, because in the US they can still do the same thing. But I do worry from an AI perspective, at least personally, when I see what's going on in China and in some other regimes in the world, and how they're using this from a government perspective, essentially to watch their people. So I'm kind of tending towards a positive personal position towards AI regulation, but the devil will absolutely be in the details of how this is going to be worked out. And so there's lots of amendments and comments going into that right now.
Yeah.
And just a comment, I think that global companies are not looking for regulations at all. I mean, the by default position is zero regulation. So we are not looking for this regulation. Now, as the European citizens, all of us, right, we do recognize the benefit of some of this. So it might kill the innovation. The problem is that we cannot have a legislation that say, okay, you are coming from Poland, so you can you can innovate, but you, because you are coming from UK, not being Europe, you cannot use it, right? So we cannot be discriminatory, right? There are some foundation of European Union that we cannot do it this way. So if there is a regulation, it applies to everything. And you know, we have the cases in Europe also of bad usage of this, right? So I'm like Tom saying that we don't like over-regulation, but some of them gives us protection as citizens, right? And as a client of financial sector as well. So as citizens, we want to be somehow protected from this innovation, right?
Can I maybe add one little thing? I was 2 weeks ago on the European Data Protection Congress here in Brussels, and so a lot of talk about GDPR, and I do feel like specifically on GDPR, when they made the regulation, they didn't really think through the consequences, and unintended consequences of regulation is certainly something to be mindful of. So the level of interconnectedness of data, and it's not just about third party, but fourth, fifth, sixth party, and the way personal data is moving around. You see these lawyers and lawmakers struggling tremendously now, like what they have created. My biggest challenge is help customers navigate the practical implications of this, like how do we do business, and business is risk-taking to some extent in this regulatory context, and GDPR is an example where I think everybody is in violation to some extent, because being completely 100% in line with GDPR in an interconnected world where everybody's using at least some personal data, and IP addresses would be personal data, for instance, and these move around all the time. It's just it creates an extremely challenging and difficult situation. And I hope with the AI Act that we don't move into this kind of territory where the regulation is just a catch-all. Zero risk from regulators, risk off, but risk off means innovation off if you're not careful. So this is kind of you want to promote innovation, you have to take risks. There's no way around it, and regulators don't always get that.
Okay, thank you. Frederik, you want to react to this?
No.
Not especially. Okay. Great, thank you. I saw there was another question, Vincent.
Yeah, Vincent. So I'm in charge with risk and compliance for a regulated institution. I'm representing as well Pay Belgium, which is the association of fintech in Belgium active in payment and electronic money. I would like to get back on the stakeholders' responsibilities between the fintech, the big tech, and the consumer. So I'm really happy to hear that big tech would be happy to bear their share of the regulation burden. So that's good to hear. And I fully agree that as a consumer, I have to be responsible of my own data, for instance. However, as a fintech, I'm a bit stuck in between because of this difference of negotiation power between a fintech and a big tech. And I have my internal audit or information security officer that do request proof that I'm still remain in charge of this and that and that. So what would be your advice to fintech to deal with regulation, consumer who are asking for responsibilities, and regulators who are asking proof to regulated entities?
Okay, so first comment, and sorry if I talk a lot about Gaia-X, but Gaia-X ambition about the regulation is to implement the automated regulation by automation, which means, and we are discussing with them a little bit to help with what we've did with IBM Cloud, is to actually being able to control and produce the documents in an automated way, right? So this will be a perfect world. Of course, there are thousands of technical aspects and others, but just to have a tool that scans the stuff, making against all the measures that you establish, and making sure that in the continuous way where you are in respecting all these measures and security rules, right? So just to let you know that we are talking a lot about Gaia-X labels. It's not about producing a new regulation. It's really the ambition is how to automate it, to remove this burden from the fintech and even financial institution and whatever players. So this is the first thing I would mention, is really to look for automation of all of this as much as possible, including in production of the evidence. So again, the idea for the startups, etc., to produce this evidence, just to make it as automated as possible, because I think that moving forward, we will still need to, Philippe, I believe, provide the evidence that the things are in place. So, yeah, technology provides this possibility of introducing innovation, including for the checking and producing of the evidence for any kind of audits.
Can I?
Sure.
As a fintech or as a European, I'm assuming you're working in a European company, or I'm going to talk mostly to European companies. So I want to give some practical advice. First one is, don't get put down by regulations. So sometimes there's so much fear about regulation and the regulators that they don't push through with certain initiatives, which I think I really recommend again. Secondly, be aware of a shared responsibility. If you're using a big tech company like Microsoft, IBM, or whoever, there's part of the control which now shift to the tech company. You're using their technology for, I don't know, access management, encryption, whatever, data center. And so for that part, and I hope there's no regulators in the room, but I would go super lightweight. The vast majority of our customers will rely upon a SOC 2 audit report. They rely upon ISO standards, etc., and do an exercise, don't overshoot. And then the other part is you still have to document quite well and think quite well about your implementation. I mean, I only know very sporadically of customers being stopped by regulators in their deployment, and each and every time it's because they were deploying things at their end in a not very secure way. And some of them went completely overboard in auditing us as a cloud provider, but then to their own IT team, they don't have the guts of saying, listen, guys, you have to think about things like access controls and how you manage identities, etc. And so, I mean, you really should be focusing 80% of your room with your IT team developing your projects, and the regulatory context should be kind of minimal or as minimal as possible, and the minimal part that you do should really be focused on your side. So I advocate for trust, and I know some regulators say, no, you can't trust these US firms, you have to turn every table, but it's just the only way of innovating very quickly in a smaller firm's context.
And having a risk management, right, approach. If you it makes sense for you, you may take some decision about your risk appetite and what you. So once you do the things which are right for the company, I would say you have this 20%, as Tim said, about regulation, but this is really the purpose of this, right? So it's really to make your company safe, so and your client safe. So this is a kind of approach that brings us to the things that are worth spending time, and others that we need to cope with.
From a business point of view, I fully agree with you, and I thank you for your answer. Now, from a legal point of view, I still have terms and conditions to sign off at the end of the day. So I do not hear that you would recommend me to adapt the terms and conditions to my size and need, actually, which is impossible.
Yeah, well, as a cloud provider, we do work with standard contractual clauses there, because one of the things is if we change something in our terms, which we do from time to time, I'm guessing most of that is negotiated by slightly bigger firms, because a lot of it will make it into our general terms for everyone. We can't really do these one-on-one modifications. We do actually, but it's in smaller things. We can't fundamentally change the ground of that. But I mean, there's ways of dealing with the legal challenges around that as well. I think the standard contractual clauses are the main element that jumps to mind. If you have a very specific challenge, certainly talk to your cloud provider about it, and maybe we can help you find a solution. But that's kind of an off-topic thing. But I did want to leave one thing: push back sometimes on the regulator, because some regulators, they're concerned about. I mean, they're all individuals, and some individuals really go overboard and take a very unreasonable position the regulation itself is principles based, and there is room for negotiation, but you also have to have the courage sometimes to push back. I don't see that happening enough, and I think that is an important message to leave here as well.
Some wise words, Tom. Exactly.
Yeah.
Thank you, Vincent, for the question. I see we have a few more minutes. Frederick, I had one more question for you. So we talked a lot about the digital finance package, about Dora. While I feel that given your background and Docbyte's scope of activities, you follow up a bit more on topics related to digital identification, digital signing, archiving, and we will definitely need to adopt more of those as well if we want to get there in this single financial European market. Is there something that you would like to highlight in this perspective?
Yeah. So the same thing again. So for us, we're, as you've noticed, we're not into infrastructure. But so the last couple of years, we've also been working quite a lot around the subject of digital onboarding. So in insurance or asset management or credit management. So, but what you see if you tackle the point of onboarding, you have a gap in there. So you have digital identification on the one hand, and you have AML on the other hand. So which is quite well regulated, and you know what you need there. But you need to collect. And for example, if you're in insurance, you want to have a vehicle registration, driver's license, or an asset management source of funds. So you need to collect all different types of documents from a customer. So you have stuff that you can find digitally, so identification and other types of data. But then you see clearly a gap when it comes to the know your customer part, so KYC. So where you have to collect all types of documents from your customers. So that's also something that you see, it's clearly not regulated, and there was a gap there. So that if you look at the digital finance package and you have a push towards offering digital services, you also need to cover that gap. So there we have the revision of ADAS, so which proposes having a digital wallet, which you can store digitally all types of documents, like your driver's license, vehicle registration, identity documents. So that will cover that gap there. So, but of course you will have a need for an authentic repository where you're going to store that information. So those are all covered within the revision. But of course, how are you going to share that information across different countries? And that's where the single digital gateway comes in, because the single digital gateway is going to harmonize how that information is going to be shared within countries, between different countries. So if you go to Portugal and you want to buy a property there, or you want to open a bank account, or to have a mortgage, they will have access to your income information from Belgium, your birth certificate, your resident information. So all those types of information will be shared between countries. So the goal of the single digital gateway is to share all information from important live events. So it's we're talking about 23 types of documents. So it's 23 categories with different types of documents and information that go in there. So which will make life easier on the one hand for the consumer, because he won't have to queue anymore at the city council to ask for a birth certificate, for example, or to get an income statement. So he will have access to that information. The same thing will go for the other state or the other or financial institution in another state. They will also have access to that information. So it will make life easier quite a lot. It will make AML and KYC processes easier. It will be there's a clear push there, and with those new types of regulations, or with those new regulations that are coming, there's of course again quite some space there for new types of services, but also for financial service companies to rethink how they are going to provide their services, and to rethink in which country they are going to provide their services, because the goal is also there to make it possible for insurance companies or financial services companies to offer their services in other countries as well. So the obligation that you had in the past that you had, or the need for a local presence, is also going to go away. So That's the the positive side of things. The negative side of things is, of course, that it opens up your markets to other players from other countries as well. So it's a bit, how would I say, yeah. The very negative side is innovate or die, of course. Yeah.
Okay.
And that's where the fintechs come in to help you.
Someone
Okay.
who wants to pick in on that? No? Okay, then I think we're just well in time. We'll leave it to that. Thank you very much, Agnieszka, Tom, Frederik, for being a great panel. Thank you all for some very interesting questions, and I think we can go off now, have some lunch. Thank you.
Thank you.